Better reading means learning techniques that can improve your comprehension and understanding, but it also means avoiding common mistakes, pitfalls that hold you back. So here I want to talk about 10, 11, 12, however many common mistakes that hold us back. There can be some easily fixed and some take more practice and time. The first one is passive reading, and that pretty much describes the exact opposite of what we're trying to do here, which is active reading. Passive reading is when we sort of let our minds drift off and we don't engage with a book. We don't ask questions. We don't read with attention. And it's very easy to fall into that because it's, at the end of the day, it's easier. But if we are to increase our understanding and elevate our wisdom, then we have to be active. And really the core of this whole channel and everything I'm trying to do is how we can read more actively and get more out of our books. Now, how do you avoid passive reading? Well, the first step is to be aware of it and to say, okay, today I'm going to sit down and read with engagement. I'm going to really go deep with the book and not just let the words fly over my eyes. I'm going to sit down and focus. And of course, that's easier said than done. And it's more than that. It's about learning the right skills to read actively and to know how to ask the right questions and where to spot what you're looking for. And those are all a whole range of skills in themselves. But the first thing is being aware of it and understanding that I'm going to go from passive reading to active reading. And just that switch in your head is enough to get the process started. The second mistake is reading without a purpose. And that can mean general reading. Why do we read in the first place? Because if someone has no reason to read, then they're not going to want to sit down and read. But we all have our reasons, whether we want to become better fathers, better tradesmen in our own profession, or if we want to increase our understanding of the world, or we want to learn history, or countless others. And it's really a personal choice. But then there's also the idea of having a purpose for the individual book we choose to read. When we pick a book off our shelf, why did we pick it? And we need that purpose and that reason to drive our sessions forward, our reading sessions. If you say, I'm going to read the Iliad because my friend told me to, that's not a convincing reason, unless maybe you trust them or they know the best books or some other external factor. But then if I were to tell you, you should read the Iliad because it's the foundation of the Western canon, suddenly that's a better idea. And if I sit down with that purpose in mind, I'm going to have much more of a reason and a meaning to go through the book with attention. The third mistake is a poor choice in your reading environment. If we choose times and spaces that work against us, we're going to have a much harder time getting into the habit of it and keeping consistent in our reading. If we pick times where we're busy or times when we have to attend to other duties, then we'll never find that opportunity to read. And equally, if we go to an environment where we're uncomfortable or where there's too many distractions, we won't be able to get anything done. So part of that, the solution is to actually change your environment factor by factor, to consider all these small things and think, how can I make it as best for me as possible? I like to read in silence on my own usually, but sometimes it can be nice to go out in a cafe and have that aura of productivity help you focus. And all of that describes a reading ritual, the term I use. And it's up to you to make your own reading ritual to make it as easy as possible for you to sit down and read. Number 4 is reading without critical thinking in mind, because it's easy to read a book and just accept everything the author is saying because you perceive him as a higher authority. And this is a complex mistake because it really depends on what you're reading. For example, if you're reading a history book, you don't really have a way to confirm whether the author is truthful or if he's accurate in his claims, because you can't exactly go to the library and find the primary sources yourself. And even if you could, no one's going to do that. But the point is to understand that authors can be wrong, obviously. And it's up to the reader to read with that in mind. And it doesn't necessarily mean being argumentative in every sentence you read, but it just means checking yourself and checking the author. Is this correct? Is what he's saying accurate? Is this line of reasoning, does it make sense? Does it hold up? And it's just having those questions in mind as you go. Now, the 5th mistake is something that I suffered with for years, and it's perfectionism. It's the idea that I don't want to read because I don't know exactly the best method to extract the understanding. And you see this everywhere online because you have all these elaborate note-taking systems with 10 different apps and a whole workflow of how I get my notes, how I process them, how I read them. And don't get me wrong, it's good to have a strong system in place, but sometimes you can get lost in the complexity. And that desire to be perfect actually has the opposite effect because you don't actually read. You're too obsessed with getting the most out of a book that you can't read the book in the first place. And you're being overly meticulous and analytical. And it just is counterintuitive. So rather than being paralyzed by the idea of having a perfect note system, which you never will have, by the way, just read. And read, and as you go, you'll pick up what works best for you. Now I know that the old system I was doing was too complicated, too long. And now I have something in place that I know isn't perfect, but I'm still going through with it. And I'm still writing notes, I'm still reading, and I've noticed my pace increase and my confidence. Because as I go, I know that even if it's not perfect in the moment, it's okay. It's good enough. And it will get better. So if you shed that thinking, that mindset, then you'll have a much better time and you'll be more confident. Number 6 is choosing the wrong books to read. Because there's a lot of books out there, and frankly, most of them suck. And even if most of them don't suck, most of them aren't relevant to our personal goals and what we wish to do. It's harmful to just read books because they are considered popular or they're trendy or other people told you to read them. Now, all of those may indicate something, yes, that's true, but we also have to know what books work best for us and the books that speak to us and are relevant to us. So how can we do that? Well, the easiest way is to apply an inspectional read to your books. And that means essentially picking up a new book, skimming it for a few minutes, reading the title, reading the blurb, and identifying A, what it's about, and B, is it relevant to me? Is it written in a way that can benefit me? Is there something I want to learn in here? And that technique will help you discern whether a book is right for you, instead of wasting your time chasing recommendations and reading books that you don't feel add any value to your life. Number 7 is masturbatory book tracking. And I'm calling myself out here. This is what I did, and I still do it to some extent. But it's obsessively tracking your reading, page by page, step by step, and spending more time on, say, Goodreads rather than actually reading yourself. Because I used to do this. I used to love to input the books I was reading and update the page count each time and read knowing I would get to do that. And I'm not saying it's bad to track books. I still do it now. I still like to update my reading. It's satisfying. It's rewarding. But there's a point where it gets too far. And you're just reading to add one to the list, to grow your list and flex on everyone. But rather than wasting time on those apps, just read. Sit down and actually get through the book. And I noticed that when you have this thing in mind, updating your reading goal or whatever, it can encourage you to read not for understanding's sake, but for completion's sake. You read because you want to finish, and you're so obsessed with finishing the book that you don't actually take time to stop and appreciate what you're doing. You're always thinking of the next book, and that can be, I had that especially strong, and it was very harmful for my comprehension. Number 8 is about missing the main point of a book. And I say main because that's important. It's missing the core argument or the main thread that binds the story together in the case of fiction. Because when we read a book, we can afford to overlook the sub-arguments and the small details. They're not that important in the bigger picture. But what is important is the bigger picture itself. We need to understand what binds the book together. And it's as easy as asking the question, what is the book about? What is the main theme of the book? And what are the chapters that build up towards that? If I tell you now to summarize a book you've read recently in a single sentence, you can try that now, and it's actually quite difficult. It's harder than you think to wrap up an entire book that could be 400 pages in a single sentence. But it's possible usually because the book is centered around one idea, no matter how big or small. And I love using the Iliad as an example. You can tell I like it. I use it in every video, but If I ask you, what is the Iliad about? And you say it's about the Trojan War, well, if you think about that, that's wrong. It's not. The book begins really deep into the Trojan War, and the book ends before it ends itself. So how can it be about the Trojan War? Rather, it's set in the Trojan War. What the book is actually about is the rage of Achilles. It's about Achilles' anger and not the Trojan War. So you have to be aware of what the central theme is to properly take the most out of a book. Number 9 is starting a book blind. What do I mean by that? I mean not knowing what the kind of book is and not knowing the purpose of the author in writing his book. Different kinds of books are meant to be read differently. And before we even jump into it in the first place, we have to classify the book so we have that in mind, so it can orient our direction and change the questions we ask. In the case of a practical book, we read in order to then apply it to our own life rather than just reading it and putting it down. Whereas in the case of poetry, we're not necessarily going to take a lesson from that and use it in our own works, in our own life, sorry. We could just read it for aesthetic's sake. And that pulls us back to the idea of inspectional reading, which is when we read a book, we skim it for just a few minutes to understand what kind of book it is, so that we can then classify it, and that when we start to read the book, we have a clearer picture of what it's going to be and what we can expect. Now, the final mistake is something that I still struggle with today. Mastery is down the line, and it's not here. If you expect too much too quickly from a reading, then you'll feel demoralized, and the idea of perfectionism will come back to haunt you, that you're not doing enough to get the most out of your reading. Because reading in itself consists of many different skills: critical thinking, note-taking, how you remember things, how you then go to apply them, spotting arguments. All these small skills build up to the wider habit of reading. And we have to learn all of them individually, and it can be really demoralizing because there's so much going on. If you take them bit by bit, even if you stumble at first, you should know that down the line, with practice, these things become unconscious habit to you. It's okay to make mistakes early on, and it's okay to feel frustration and not expect too much from your reading. Know that it gets better, and there is light at the end of the tunnel. So I hope all those reading mistakes help you see what there is to avoid, and how you can hopefully take each one and use the solution I provided to improve your reading. And I know it's a lot at first, but it's probably true that you have some of these in order already, but there might be some other mistakes you are prone to. Like, I know I'm prone to perfectionism and tracking too much rather than just sitting down and reading. And that's okay, as long as we work on each one ourselves and create a personal sort of plan for how we're going to improve. That's fine. And of course, thank you for watching.